Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover in this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of the movies and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a film made. And that, I think, is in all the preamble we need. I'm going to move ahead with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of the podcast. And as always, I'll set it up with a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
If I told you about her, the princess without voice, what would I say?
Eliza, come on. Eliza, hurry.
She deaf?
Mute, sir. She can hear you.
You clean that lab, you get out.
This may very well be the most sensitive asset ever to be housed in this facility.
You may think that thing looks human. Stands on two legs, right? But we're created in the Lord's image. You don't think that's what the Lord looks like, do you?
This creature is intelligent, capable of language, of understanding emotions.
And that is a clip from 2017's The Shape of Water, directed by Guillermo del Toro, screenplay by del Toro and Vanessa Taylor, story credited to del Toro as well, and starring Sally Hawkins, Michael Shannon, Richard Jenkins, Doug Jones, Michael Straubach and Octavia Spencer. Now, the story of The Shape of Water actually goes back, let's go all the way back to the 1950s. Let's start in and around there. And that was the release of the classic horror movie Creature from the Black Lagoon. Now, ever since its original release all those years ago, lots of people have caught up with Creature from the Black Lagoon who didn't necessarily see it first time round, and they've certainly become aware of it, and two of those people would spark a journey that would take a sort of version of that creature to the stage of the Academy Awards over 60 years later. So, talking to the Chicago Reader, let's start with a man called Daniel Krauss, a writer who recalled when he was 15 years old that he was standing on a tennis court in Iowa when he had an idea. Already a fan of the Black Lagoon film, and a character he always felt wasn't actually really doing anything wrong, he said that the extent of the idea was the creature from the Black Lagoon is put in a lab, a janitor finds him and decides to break him out and put him in a tub. And that was it for many years. That was the idea that festered in the head of a then teenage Krauss. And he jotted the idea down in his notebook. And over the years, as he got more and more notebooks, it was one of the ideas that got transferred from one to the other. And as Krauss would tell the Chicago Reader, it was always on the list, but it was never first or second. Now, he was building a writing career, though, and his first novel was published in 2009, entitled The Monster Variations, but it was his second novel, Rotters, that really put him on the map, and it was also a book that put him onto the radar of Guillermo del Toro, with the pair meeting for breakfast in December 2011. At this point, Del Toro had just abandoned the director's chair on the Hobbit movies that he was intending to make. Pan's Labyrinth had very firmly put him on the map as a major international filmmaking force. He'd done the Hellboy films that he directed to this point as well. And when they met in December 2011, he was making his first film in some time, actually, Pacific Rim, that was shooting in Toronto. And so Del Toro and Krause had a conversation, and the idea was that they would collaborate on bringing the novel Troll Hunters to the screen, which is something they duly did. But it was at the end of that meeting that Del Toro, as things were winding down, turned to Krause and just said, "Have you got any other ideas?" And it turns out he did, because Krause regaled Del Toro with the idea of this janitor working in a secret government facility. I mean, government facilities for a start, that's absolute magic to Del Toro. He'd certainly played with those in his 2 Hellboy movies, and he was intrigued. Then the idea of bringing in the Creature from the Black Lagoon in a government facility, and it's the story through the eyes of this janitor. Well, these were ingredients that Del Toro, A, he could work with, but B, was really intrigued by. And so off he went to finish off Pacific Rim, but over the course of 2012 through to 2014, really, a process was underway that saw him start on a story, put a script together, and really just work with this idea. He would bring in a co-writer, Vanessa Taylor, to work with him on it. And it took until 2014, really, to get the whole story together, that it evolved in that period of time. So a subplot involving Russian spies, for instance, that had been expanded. And what happened was Del Toro pitched the idea as a relatively low budget film to Fox Searchlight, then owned by 20th Century Fox, not now the subdivision of Disney as it is now. And once Searchlight was interested, he took it to Vanessa Taylor. And so Del Toro explained we'd meet, and then she said, "I think you need to add or expand this layer of the Cold War and the Russian spy and make it more of a character and put pressure on the bad guy, blah, blah, blah," his words. And Del Toro said we started exchanging these ideas, and we exchanged files, and I would give her my files, she would rewrite them mercilessly, then I would grab her files and I would rewrite them mercilessly and send them back and forth. Now, Del Toro in interviews has talked about screenwriting being the toughest part of the project, particularly when you're working alone. Here he had a collaborator and found it more enjoyable, even though he and Taylor didn't actually really meet up. And they were working sort of in isolation, but exchanging ideas and exchanging drafts. And she worked on the film for about a draft and a half, really. It was Del Toro who ultimately saw it through to fruition. And he had this agreement, this interest from Fox Searchlight to make the film. We will be coming back to that agreement just shortly, because one of the things that was coming across when Del Toro was writing his version of the film was he had in mind people to star in it. It's often a cliche you hear in press junkets and in interviews that a director or a writer would say, "I couldn't imagine anyone else in the role," or "I wrote this role specifically for them." But in this case, Del Toro was a huge fan of British actor Sally Hawkins, that he caught her, for instance, in Mike Leigh's film Happy Go Lucky. If you remember that film, that's where she takes driving lessons off Eddie Marsan, a terrifying film that is. Also, he caught her in the BBC series Fingersmith as well. And what Del Toro was envisaging was the idea of a mute cleaner at a secret government research facility, and he was writing this around very much with Sally Hawkins at the front of his head. Now, Sally Hawkins didn't know this, and he didn't actually meet her until 2013. Now, this was a party at the celebrating the Golden Globes that had taken place that year, and one of the winners at that particular Golden Globes was the filmmaker Alfonso Cuarón, who'd taken home prizes for the film Gravity. And he rang his old friend Del Toro and said, come on, we're having a party. Now, Del Toro hadn't been at the Globes, had no intention of going to a party either, but he invited Del Toro over so they could get drunk together and celebrate. And as Del Toro told Vulture, a car was sent for him, and over the course of the evening, he relatively quickly downed 14 shots of tequila. And it was while he was leaving the party with 14 shots of tequila just making their way through his body, he saw Sally Hawkins on the way out, and he called her over. And again, this exchange was regaled in the interview to Vulture. "Sally, Guillermo, I hugged her," he said. "And I said, I'm writing a movie for you where you fall in love with a fish man." And she said, "Great." And that was our first meeting. Hawkins, though, would soon realise that Del Toro was absolutely deathly serious about this and was very quickly aboard the project as well. As part of her research and preparation for it, she was given a box set, actually, of silent comedians to study ahead of shooting. And in particular, Del Toro asked her to focus on the work of Stan Laurel of Laurel and Hardy fame. As he would explain, it was because this guy can do a state of grace without conveying it verbally. And so Hawkins studied them and their behaviour, and put together a character who Del Toro would argue is unlike any other character in the movie. So Doug Jones, of course, a regular collaborator of Guillermo del Toro, he was always going to be the key choice to play the creature of the film. The creature in this particular movie is known as the Amphibian Man, in quote marks. It's never actually named per se. Now, Jones created some amazing monsters on screen for Del Toro. You just look at the incredible work in Pan's Labyrinth, for example, of that. Now, for this, Jones, the role again written for him, the roles played by Octavia Spencer and Michael Shannon as well, they were also written directly for the actors concerned, who duly signed on. Fox Searchlight then had agreed to back the film, but there was still something of a conundrum to resolve, because Del Toro was thinking very much in the style of the 1950s horrors that had influenced really the creation of The Shape of Water. And also he was setting this film, he didn't expressly date it, but it was in the 1960s. That's where he decided to pitch the movie. And so one of the creative choices he was facing was just how to shoot it, inevitably. In this particular case, do you shoot it in black and white or do you shoot it in colour? And so he took this conversation to Fox Searchlight, expecting just the usual straight no, you're not doing it in black and white. But what he got back in return was something slightly different from what he was expecting, that Searchlight would press ahead with a black and white movie if that's what he wanted, but he would have to take a hit on the budget for doing so. And so the prices he was working with, if he was going to do it in black and white, Fox Searchlight would put up a budget of $17 million. If he wanted to do it in colour, he would get a budget of $19.6 million. And so there was a bit of head scratching there. In the end, Del Toro, of course, opted for colour, as you probably know. And production designer Paul Osterberry, he was one of those who admitted he was just really pleased because, as he would argue, we were struggling at even $19.6 million to get it all down. So thankfully, it went that way, he meant, in terms of they went for colour and a little bit more money. It did also mean that Osterberry and Del Toro would fashion a visual look of the film that would be colour-coded, and there's quite a lot written about that online as well. Just look at the way greens are used in The Shape of Water, for instance. And also, the prep for the film was tricky for a bunch of reasons. The design of the amphibian creature, for one, took a lot of work. As Del Toro explained to The Wrap, he said, we designed the creature as what it is. It's a river god, an elemental river god. And he said it needs to have majesty and beauty without losing its nature. Now, in the film, this river god, inverted commas, is transported in a cylindrical capsule as well. And just that one detail, designing that capsule for the creature, took 2 months of work just to realise and manufacture just that one single prop. Meanwhile, Osterberry and Del Toro were putting an enormous amount of detail into the set design as well. If you freeze frame several times Shape of Water, you'll just get an absolute flavour of that. But one of the reasons Del Toro was able to do it, and one of the reasons that Fox Searchlight was able to sign on and not really get in the way, was very early in the process. What Del Toro had done was elected to fund some of the early design work himself, particularly the creature design work, because what he wanted to do was, quote, I wanted to go to a studio with the design and the idea for the movie and basically say, you guys tell me how much you want me to do it for, and I'll do it for that number. There will be no negotiation. It was going to be as simple as that. Now, implicit in that is you give Del Toro a number by which he will make the film, and he will get the creative control he needs to make the film. And as it turned out, that's pretty much the way it went. Filming could begin then on August the 15th, 2016, and shooting was again, as it had with Pacific Rim, going to take place in Canada. So Toronto hosted large sections of the shoot for The Shape of Water. In particular, the movie house that we see in the film is a combination of a couple of things. We see that, the movie house in the film is called the Orpheum, and it's a mix of the Winter Gardens in Toronto, the Elgin Theatre in Toronto, and the Victorian Massey Hall as well. Sets were also built at the Cinespace Studios in the city too. And Del Toro and his team knew that they were trying to realise something fiendishly ambitious, really, on a very, very tight budget. That what Del Toro has argued several times across his films, he did this on Nightmare Alley, that who'd follow The Shape of Water up with as well, was that you basically have more ideas than you can afford. You are always looking to push beyond the budget. You never quite have the resources you need to do everything that you want. He quite liked working that way, just to help get him a couple of extra shooting days, a couple of extra cranes for certain shots, even a couple of extra costumes. Del Toro would pass up his upfront salary as producer, co-producer, co-writer and director, that he would take the minimum mandated guild amount for the salary and take anything on the back end rather than the front, just so they had a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit more resource to make the film in the first place. The level of preparation and detail, though, just go into that. Just look at the preparation for the score that Alexander Desplat, a regular collaborator with Del Toro, he had been briefed on the score, but a good couple of years, really, before the film came out. That the eventual score would take him 6 weeks to complete. He would work with rough footage that was provided by Del Toro, but the actual fundamental foundation of it had been provided a long, long time before the first camera was unpacked and the first shot was in the can. Let's go back to Doug Jones then, who we talked to for Film Stories magazine earlier in the year. And he, the level of preparation just to get into the suit and the special makeup to become the Amphibian Man, well, actually, by the standards of the creature creations he'd done for Del Toro in the past, was relatively light. If you look at the Fawn in Pan's Labyrinth, that took many more hours. In the case of The Shape of Water, it was a 3-hour job to get him into the outfit and about 40 minutes to take him out of it. And the brief for the character from Del Toro to Jones, as was relayed to NPR, was Del Toro wanted to see no trace of the human in the Amphibian Man. Quote, he wanted to really see an ecosystem that came from another place, another world, another species. He wanted to see her heroic stance that would warrant why I was worshipped, as Doug Jones explained, as a god in the Amazon. And he said, so that comes with a certain regalness, a certain royalty kind of posturing, and then just as an added ingredient at the end, Del Toro just threw in a little bit of a matador in there too. Now, Jones has talked about the difficulty of performing in a creature suit as well, that it regularly impairs hearing, for instance, and sight, and in this case, no exception at all. As Jones would explain, he said, my ears were covered with latex foam rubber, and the gills were right next to my ears as well, and they were mechanically operated. So for Jones's working day on the shoot, he would hear these noises in his ears as the scene was moving on, and he had to block that out in order to put forward his performance. One just practical note, Jones is asked about this a lot. How do you accommodate necessities of toilet in the suits? In the case of the Amphibian Man, at the front, let's say, how biological do we go? At the front, things were all fine and dandy. At the back, let's just say there were 18-hour stretches where that was not an option, and so dietary demands had to be programmed and planned with that in mind, because Jones was 3 hours in makeup to start with. The shooting day would be 12 hours usually, then there was getting everything off and getting ready to go, and the option to partake in certain toilet activities was not available for the large part of his day. The physical production of The Shape of Water would wrap up in November of 2016, on the 6th, as it happened. And again, straight into post-production and dealing with the resources that were available to realise and finish the film. Del Toro's previous movie, after all, had cost the best part of $200 million to make, and that was before release and marketing. That was going to get a wide blockbuster release, that being Pacific Rim, of course. In the case of The Shape of Water, Searchlight knew that it had to have this really into festivals. That was the way it was going to build up the audience for the movie. Del Toro had brought it in on budget. The cost of it was said to be between $19.5–20 million. Nothing particularly over the top there. And the post-production, well, a lot of the work had been done practically in camera. I mean, that was really key to the way Del Toro was looking to work. And then working with his cinematographer Dan Lawston, they fashioned this color-coded world, really. And it was over to Sidney Wolinski in the editing suite, who edited the movie, to really get the cut down to the 123-minute version of the film that would be ready for debut towards the summer of 2017. But again, as going into the edit, this is where there'd been so much preparation done, and it had taken so many years to get to this point that Del Toro knew what he was doing. I mean, even if you go back to the prep of the film, when Del Toro was talking to actors about potentially getting involved, he'd reportedly written very, very extensive backstories for the characters, for the actors to use or not to use. Some did, some didn't. Furthermore, one lovely story actually is once Sally Hawkins had finished shooting the underwater sequences that were required of her for Shape of Water, she then had to fly straight the way back to London because she jumped from this straight onto the peerless Paddington 2. What do you know? She was back doing underwater sequences on the first day of Paddington 2 as well. Del Toro talked about just the importance of this of The Shape of Water to him during, well, really in the build-up to the film's release, that he had this $19.5 million. He'd made sure his dollars had counted and were on the screen, and he reflected to IndieWire that this movie is a healing movie for me. Now, it's no secret that he'd had some tremendously difficult experiences with his films in the past. Miramax, for instance, then under the stewardship of convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein, had cut one of his earlier films to bits. He'd had his fair share of scars, his fair share of battles. But also he dug heavily into his life, and again he told IndieWire, for 9 movies I rephrased the fears of my childhood, the dreams of my childhood, and he reflected on The Shape of Water. This is the first time I speak as an adult about something that worries me as an adult, and he says I speak about trust, otherness, sex, love, where we're going, and he says these are not concerns that I had when I was 9 or when I was 7, but these were the threads that he was weaving into The Shape of Water. With the film complete, the movie debuted at the Venice International Film Festival at the end of August 2017. I remember how anticipated the feature was, and it would be fair to say it did not disappoint, that it would walk away from the Venice Film Festival with the Golden Lion Prize for Best Film, but also the reviews for the film were incredibly strong, that this was being regarded as pretty much peak Del Toro, mentioned in the same sentence as Pan's Labyrinth, with rave reviews pretty much across the board. There were 1 or 2 people who were a little less keen on it, but on the whole, this was a very loud outpouring of love and appreciation for a genre film that was talking about a whole bunch of stuff that was beautifully realised. This really increased the confidence of Searchlight as well, that it might just have an awards film on its hands. Now, awards bodies don't tend to like genre films, and here we have a mix of science fiction, a little taste of horror. It's not the kind of thing really where you need a fresh cupboard from IKEA to house all your gongs from the major awards circuit, but the plot was, as you would expect, that Searchlight would give this a slowly built up release, would do an awards campaign for it, open it on a few screens, get the word of mouth moving, and that is basically what happened with the film, that The Shape of Water would open in American cinemas at the start of December 2017 off the back of this huge outpouring of acclaim from Venice, and it would only open on 2 screens with a stunning screen average of $83,000, a huge amount of money just on a per screen basis. That it grossed $166,000 just on those 2 screens to break into the top 20 at the US box office. There was another just slower platform release that week as well. That was The Disaster Artist, which again $63,000 per screen that was getting. Woody Allen's Wonder Wheel opened that weekend, and I mean its per screen average was again high but not particularly great. The broader chart was being topped by arguably Pixar's best film, might have that chat another time, Coco. Justice League was around, Wonder was around, Thor Ragnarok, but these weren't the films at that stage that Shape of Water was going up against, because over the coming weeks what Searchlight inevitably did, as the word of mouth started to bring, was it added screens. And so by week 2 it was on to 41 screens, and the film was now in 14th place at the US box office. It started to get a lot broader. You have to go forward just like a week or two more. It was on 158 screens in its third week, and it moved up to 726. The closest at that stage it was getting to a broad release for Christmas weekend in the US, and that's when it broke into the top 10. That it grossed $3 million as its screen count rocketed, even as films such as The Last Jedi were around, Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, Pitch Perfect 3, The Greatest Showman was opening, Downsizing was opening, Father Figures was opening. The competition was sizable, and yet The Shape of Water continued to hold its own. The following week, with roughly the same screen count, the box office was up another $3.5 million in the bank. And then if you go forward another week, well, another $3 million. And so the film was reliably bringing in, just in America alone, $3-4 million a week, even as the awards nominations were starting to be notched up. Crucially amongst them, the Academy Awards. At the 90th Academy Awards, The Shape of Water led the charge with 13 Academy Award nominations. There is a huge list of prizes that The Shape of Water has been nominated for and ultimately won. The Academy Awards run was regarded as really something quite spectacular. I mean, as much as discredited as the Golden Globes are, they were still at this point in 2018, as the awards were coming around, seen as some kind of indicator of just whether the film would break through. Del Toro took home a Best Director Golden Globe. The film's score picked up a gong as well. But by the time it got to the stage of the Oscars, well, it had been nominated for 13 awards, but would it actually take many of those home? Before we get to that bit, I do want to note that when the film had its official premiere in Toronto, a lovely bit of trivia, the said premiere took place at the Elgin Theatre, and you might just remember that was also where part of the film was shot, and it was screened in the very place where Del Toro had been shooting the movie. But let's jump forward then to the Academy Awards, taking place on March the 4th, 2018 in the Dolby Theatre in Los Angeles, where for the Best Picture prize, Del Toro's The Shape of Water was up against Call Me By Your Name, Darkest Hour, Dunkirk, Get Out, Lady Bird, Phantom Thread, The Post, 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. A really strong Best Picture field. By the time the final gong was announced, Del Toro had already picked up an Oscar for Best Director, and as you more than likely know, The Shape of Water took home the best picture prize at that year's Oscars. It would pick up 4 Academy Awards in all. The leader of the evening, it had the most nominations and the most awards. And here was a genre film that had utterly broken through. And it wasn't just a case of it had taken home the Oscars. The box office too, it had found an audience. That this film that had cost $19.5-ish million, give or take 100,000 or so, had racked up $63.8 million just in America, but outside of America it really spread as well. Another 131 million outside of the States, and the film's box office gross just off its theatrical run was just a few quid short of $200 million in all. This was a raging success, and the film at that point too that Del Toro would declare was his favourite of all the ones that he had made to that point. It fueled where he was going next too, that he, off the back of the success of The Shape of Water, he was able to re-team with Searchlight and secure more money for his next picture, Nightmare Alley. In tandem, he was also working on an animated film called Pinocchio, which came out in 2022 and would win Del Toro another Oscar. But for many people, The Shape of Water remains absolute peak Del Toro and one of the finest Best Picture Oscar winners of the last 10, 20 years. For me, I'm very, very firmly in that camp. I love this film. I love this film an enormous amount, and I love the Oscar-winning score as well. If you've not had the pleasure, what a treat you've got in store. But who knew that going all the way back to the 1950s, that what on paper could have been an easily dismissible horror film would have a footprint that not just made that original 1954 movie still resonate, but it would inspire something so special many decades later. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. I've got a couple of little requests and parish notices, but I do want to address the fact for regular listeners that I wasn't here last week. It's very rare in the 5.5-year history of Film Stories that I miss an episode for circumstances out of my control. They were entirely out of my control. I'm sorry for the temporary introduction, and I trust you. Well, let's just say it wouldn't happen if it wasn't something bordering emergency. So apologies for my absence, but there was a good reason for it. If you like this podcast, if I can ask a couple of things of you, if you don't mind, if you like it enough to put some money into it, if you head to patreon.com/SimonBrew, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You get it ad-free as well. You find out what I'm up to behind the scenes, and the money goes back into the Film Stories project too. It doesn't pay for expensive holidays for me, although I wouldn't mind one. Costing you absolutely nothing is if you subscribe to the podcast at your podcast home of choice. That's always much appreciated. Likewise, if you could leave ideally a hugely positive review. These things are gold dust to independent podcasts like this. I am not a massive organisation. At the point I'm talking to you now, I am a man in a very messy room in the West Midlands, just doing my best really, and I thank you for all the support that's got me this far. Film Stories magazine, well, big changes coming there, which are going to be announced next week. But if you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you'll see what we're up to in print as well. And hopefully news will have landed by the time this podcast hits. I'm not going into detail on this episode just in case it hasn't. You'll find the latest issue of Film Junior being teased there as well. And I have Blu-rays coming up, new Blu-ray releases here in the UK of a pair of Kevin Costner films from the 1980s. We've got Bull Durham getting its UK Blu-ray debut. We've got No Way Out getting its UK Blu-ray debut too. You can find those shortly at store.filmstories.co.uk. But that is enough parish notices. I'm going to move on now to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories, and it is another film I absolutely adore. Let me play you a clip from its trailer. I'm going to come to the story of it the other side of this.
Okay, are you ready? There we go. What color is that? Brown. Maybe if we take a pencil and then we make a face, and then we see the life in the eyes. Life is always in the eyes. There's our monster. How does the story begin?
With a boy, too old to be a kid.
You're coming to live with me. Don't touch anything.
Too young to be a man.
I no longer see you.
What did he do?
He called for a monster.
That then is a clip from the trailer of 2006's A Monster Calls, directed by Juan Antonio Bayona, screenplay by Patrick Ness, based on A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness from an idea by Siobhan Dowd, and the cast led by Felicity Jones, Toby Kebbell, Sigourney Weaver, Lewis McDougall and Liam Neeson. So the story of A Monster Calls goes back to a name I've just mentioned, Siobhan Dowd, an author who had a cancer diagnosis. No easy way around this bit of the story, sadly. And she'd been diagnosed. She conceived the idea of what became A Monster Calls, but fate was really against her completing the story. This was the tale of a mother also with a terminal illness and her young son being visited by a monster in the middle of the night to help him really just try and make sense of what's going on. This was a story targeted at young adults dealing with some very difficult themes, and it was an idea that Dowd never got to see to completion, that her cancer caught up with her, and she passed in 2007. With regards to Monster Calls, she left an opening, she left 1,000 words, the idea for a structure, and she left a few characters, but the story was fundamentally incomplete. Now, she did, as you would expect, share an editor with a couple of other authors, and one of those was an author by the name of Patrick Ness. And so it was their shared editor who took the material to him and asked him, would he consider completing the story? So Ness was interested, but he was reluctant, because what he didn't want to do was write a book that would just be a tribute to a book he thought someone else had conceived and would have done in a certain way. He didn't want to write it that way. He didn't want to do kind of best guess of what was in Siobhan Dowd's mind. For him to do it, he had to really do it as his book. And he felt the pressure of it as well. He would explain ultimately to Awards Daily, you have to pay attention to the story first. You have to question, are you writing a memorial or are you writing a story? Now, Siobhan Dowd, he argued, would not have done a memorial. She would have let it grow organically. And Patrick Ness reasoned that the worst outcome was that I could write a bad book. And he took a look at it, but then he said it started suggesting other ideas. And he said the very first idea I had was the scene when Connor, the young 12-year-old lead character in the story, comes out of the second tale that the monster of it tells to discover that he's discovered his grandmother's sitting room. And so Ness agreed to take the project on, and he completed the story. It was then handed over to an illustrator by the name of Jim Kay, who gave it a very, very beautiful and pronounced look. The final version of A Monster Calls was published in 2011. Now, the book was received superbly. Kay and Ness, incidentally, didn't actually meet until it was completed. The story would win the Carnegie Medal, it would win the Greenway Medal, prestigious prizes. It would become a hugely lauded piece of children's literature. And it was read by, amongst other people, Sergio Sanchez, described as a voracious reader, but also someone who happened to be the screenwriter of a couple of films. Those films would be The Orphanage and The Impossible. Now, those films in turn were directed by a man called J.A. Bayona, Juan Antonio Bayona, and Sergio Sanchez passed the book over to J.A. Bayona, who took a look at it, and as he described it, recognised at once the themes I touched on in The Orphanage and The Impossible. Characters finding themselves in very intense situation with death on the horizon. And he would ultimately argue that by completing A Monster Calls, he'd done a little informal trilogy of films, really, that were linked by theme, even if it wasn't conceived at the start of all of this, that he would be doing 3 films of this ilk back to back. So Bayona was interested, and there was quickly intent to bring the film to the story to the screen as well. That it was a Spanish company, Telecino Cinema, that funded some early development work. Bayona got them involved as well. He was very quickly involved and going to direct. And then Bayona met up with Patrick Ness with a view of adapting the story. That he wanted to talk to the author. He wanted to get in fairly early in the process. Bayona also was assembling a team, a producer by the name of Belén Atienza, and also, as he explained to Screen Daily, he said, I started to work on this about 2.5 years ago. He was doing this interview at the point it was released, and he said, I was finishing the promotional tour for The Impossible. I was about to shoot the first 2 episodes of the TV series Penny Dreadful, and that's when I met Patrick Ness, and we decided to make this together. So as well as Belén Atienza, the other hires brought in very early in the process by Bayona included the cinematographer Oscar Fora, editors Bernat Villaplana and Jaume Martí, and production designer Eugenio Caballero, and then another crucial hire there was the VFX supervisor by the name of Felix Bergès and a special effects supervisor, Pau Costa. And it's notable that there are both VFX and special effects supervisors, not the same job, as experts in both have a habit of reminding me when I trip over that one. Now, before all those people could get heavily involved, the limelight really was on Ness and Bayona to fashion a screenplay, and the pair of them took a fair amount of time to work out the details of what they needed to do to take the book of A Monster Calls and turn it into something that would work on the screen. Because Bayona was insistent. He said, we didn't want to make a melodrama. He said, everything's got to be integrated. Connor, again the lead characters, diverging relationships with his mother and his grandmother, and this fantastical element of the story. Because one of the key things about A Monster Calls is the young character of Connor, as the title suggests, is visited by this big monster, this tree-like monster. And Bayona said, I realised that the 40-foot high monster would need to be depicted by integrating 2D and 3D animation. That was how he was quickly reconciling it was going to have to come to the screen. The requirement for effects work and animation was in turn driving the potential cost of the film up, although I would still suggest this was a very, very frugal production when you look at what was put on the screen. And so in came a pair of financiers, River Road Entertainment and Participant Media, who fairly quickly were on board with the film and weren't getting in the way of the movie that Bayona was looking to make. And so this started really to become a thing in March of 2014. And that's when we got the news on our side of the fence that a significant amount of cash was being promised for the film. That Focus Features was going to pick up the distribution of it, in America at least. It was going to commit $20 million just towards the print cost and the advertising cost, so it could give the movie a fighting chance. Now, A Monster Calls distributors were varied around the world. In the UK, it was picked up by Entertainment One. At the point this is being recorded, Entertainment One has just shut its London office because Hasbro, which bought Entertainment One in 2019, decided it didn't want to do film distribution in the UK anymore, so that office has closed. Entertainment One's assets, apart from the ones Hasbro wanted, have been sold to Lionsgate, and another good distributor of films has been wiped off the table. Entertainment One, nonetheless, was one of the companies that put money into this and gave it a wide release in the UK, and I did just want to salute the fact that it actually did so. Now, all these distributors weren't actually paying for the film, but they were giving it a chance at success, and there was a very real sense that the film was on a bit of a fast track by this point, with talk of a release already in 2016, which, when you consider the complexities involved in visualising the story, well, that was something of a pace about it. Patrick Ness was staying close to it, pretty much throughout the project as well. And by April 2014, the ink was on the deal. Focus was indeed going to be the US distributor, to the point where it announced a release date as well of October the 14th, 2016, just over 2 years. And so, even though casting hadn't been sorted at this stage, there was some prep work underway, the cash was in place, a director was on board, and it wasn't really going to take an awful long time from there to take the next leap. That casting, I mean, the first person I saw that was announced on board, for instance, was Felicity Jones, also in April of 2014. They didn't mess around, they got going. Meanwhile, while the casting was being done, prep time was being spent visualising just what the monster would look like on screen. I mean, A Monster Calls has subsequently also been adapted for stage, and they've hit similar logistical problems of just what this creature looks like. Now, Jim Kay was brought in. You might remember he illustrated the book, and he was working on concept art. He was doing hundreds and hundreds of designs, although what they actually ended up with was something close to where he started, predictably enough. That Kay had drawn influence originally to a painting by Goya called The Colossus. They knew too in their heart that this monster needed a kind of male human gait and approach to it by nature of who was going to be cast in that role. Liam Neeson would be the monster. I'll come to him shortly. But also the film's monster was going to be made up of twisty branches, and his face had to have some kind of resemblance to that of Connor as well. But however, as Bayona explained to the New York Times, he also wanted to put a space in there for the audience to fill in some of the gaps, for its imagination to do a little bit of the work. Now, with Sigourney Weaver came on board, that was a real coup for the casting of the film, the only non-British actor really in one of the key roles. But the really tricky role to nail was this character of Connor. This was something that required a young performer to do quite a lot, well, a really hefty amount, I'd suggest, of dramatic lifting in the story. And so what Bayona and the team did is they went to a real legend in British casting, Shaheen Baig. I mean, just the other week I was watching everybody's talking about Jamie movie and who's doing the casting there. You go right through a whole bunch of British films and Shaheen Baig's name is on the casting and discovering a whole host of talent. And so it was around 1,000 children in the end would audition or be seen for the film. Shaheen Baig had worked with Bayona on The Impossible. It was a long process to find the young actor to play Connor. In the end, they narrowed it down to 5, as Bayona explained to Screen Daily, and it was Lewis McDougall who'd picked up a role in the film Pan, who was obviously, in Bayona's eyes, the best. In fact, he would argue in a separate interview that he found Lewis McDougall fairly early in the process, but stuck with him throughout, even as the prolonged casting process was ongoing. So the cast was in place. Toby Kebbell was brought in as well. But for most of them just weren't going to be needed until the start of filming, with the exception of Liam Neeson. Because Neeson had been brought in to voice the monster, inverted commas, but also they wanted more than just his voice. They wanted to capture his movements. They wanted to capture his gait. And it was thus a couple of weeks before the main block of shooting began that Bayona and Liam Neeson met up in Oxford here in the UK, Audio Motion Studios, and it was a couple of weeks of motion capture performance work that was done because, as Felix Berger explained to Screen Daily, we created a bunch of different animations of the monster. So when we went to shoot, we could make real-time tracking of the camera. We mixed the animation we did with Liam with Lewis's performance, and they needed that reference on set. They needed it before the main bulk of filming could begin, so that they had something tangible to work with when Lewis McDougall was on set realising this role of Connor. Now, the start of production was announced for the 30th of September 2014, with participant media putting out a press release announcing this and saying there's an autumn 2016 release on the cards. Bayona had been really keen to keep the British roots of the story in place, and so the start of production was in the UK. That the film shot in both Spain and Britain, but for 4 weeks it was just outside of Manchester that the filming was ongoing. They shot around the Preston area as well. They went to Blackpool Pleasure Beach at one point. They went up to Yorkshire, and so that was a good month before they went off to 15 weeks to work in Barcelona on it. The animation elements of the film were being handled in 2 different countries, and so we got the stuff that was going on in the UK, but also it was Headless Productions based in Barcelona that was working consistently on A Monster Calls. Bayona was wanting Headless Productions to work in watercolour to mix the drawing style of the young Connor and his mother in the film, and this was crucial to kind of the look and the design of the animated elements that he was pointing towards. In terms of the colour palette of the film more broadly, Bayona was taking influence from the likes of 1950s American musicals. It was also looking at the colours of Akira Kurosawa films as well. And so Bayona would explain the practicalities on set, and going back to the fact that they'd spent all this time with motion capture with Liam Neeson, and as he told The Wrap, Liam was also always acting in front of Lewis, so when the motion capture was done, Lewis McDougall was there as well. And Bayona said, then on the set we had a life-size replica of the head, the arms and 1 foot of the monster, and it was an acting coach that would then feed Lewis McDougall the lines. Sometimes Bayona would do that, but it was crucial to them that Lewis McDougall was always acting in front of something real. He didn't want green screen, he didn't want ping pong balls, he wanted something tangible for his young lead actor to respond to. Now, this placed demands on the production of the film because it meant it was going to require practical work and visual effects work as well. One of the touch points Bayona consistently talked through when promoting and talking about the film was the original King Kong, and particularly the stop motion elements of King Kong as well. And as he explained to Screen Daily, there is a moment in King Kong where there's a moment in A Monster Calls where you can see the old King Kong, when you can see how they turn from a shot that is mainly the stop motion And then you see the real hand grabbing Fay Ray in that King Kong movie. And he said, I love the thing that makes it feel so real. And he argues it's got soul somehow. And I wanted to do the same. And that's why on the set, you've got a mix of puppetry. You've got a mix of CG. You've got a mix of tangible physical effects. Even actually when realising some of the one or two of the core effects moments for the film, they were using miniatures as well. There was a lot of old-fashioned techniques used that were blending with the modern to just get the look that Bayona was looking for the film. It was quite a long shoot, but by March of 2015 it was wrapped up, but there was a lot of lengthy post-production work ahead of the movie, spread again across more than one country. And so perhaps it wasn't a massive surprise when the release date of the film did alter, that it was no longer going for an October release, for a wide release anyway, and it was going down the awards channel instead. That seemed to be, as we saw with The Shape of Water, the logical way just to move this forward. And so the wider release was pushed back till the end of 2016, early 2017, with the exception of Spain, where it held that autumn slot. But the movie was actually going to debut a little bit around the same time, a little bit earlier. The Toronto International Film Festival in September 2016 is where this film, which had now cost $43 million to make, was going to go in front of audience eyeballs for the first time. That said, there was still a lot of work in post-production, just fine-tuning this monster. I mean, Felix Burgess explained to Variety, he said, we spent a lot of time working on the correct expressions for the monster. When it moves, the pieces never bend like rubber. They're always moving and sliding, he argues. And he said it was important to make something believable. The rigging of the character became the language he used to create his movement. And so Headless started the work on this in 2D and gradually brought it out to 3D. And once Bayona had a cut, he did something he'd done since his film The Orphanage. He showed it to an old friend of his, wouldn't you know it, a man called Guillermo del Toro, who took a look, gave one or two notes, and gave him just a fresh pair of eyeballs on the movie. The film debuted at the Toronto Film Festival, and the critical response to it was strong. And in particular, the fact that it was talking to a young audience about really difficult stuff and doing it in a way that didn't talk down to them, didn't patronise them, didn't really compromise what it was looking to do. They knew this would mean it was going to be a tough sell, and really to make this a box office success, it was going to need some awards fuel behind it to give it a long run and to let people find really the film in the first place. The reviews coming out of the Toronto Film Festival were very good. They weren't indicating that this was going to threaten the top awards though. And so, even though in the end A Monster Calls did pick up an assortment of prizes across a few critics' awards, when it came to it, it was nowhere to be seen in the Academy Awards. It was nowhere to be seen with the Golden Globes or anything like that either. It was fairly genre-based stuff and audience popularity stuff where A Monster Calls did find a little bit of awards attention. But still, for its wider release, it was still getting good reviews, and so there was a hope that the film could just just build a bit of a footprint for itself when it landed just on its cinema release. The opening weekend in America for it was, well, you have to go to Christmas weekend in 2016, December the 23rd to the 25th. It got it played on 4 screens just to qualify for awards, and early signs were okay. That its screen average was 7,700. That was lagging behind the new Ben Affleck film Live by Night, by distance lagging behind the new Scorsese film Silence, which had also opened on 4 screens to a screen average of 32,000. There were quite a lot of films just around at that point that were opening with small releases. Patriots Day starring Mark Wahlberg, lots was expected of that. The screen average of it, great. Hidden Figures was that weekend as well. And then you had the bigger movies as well, that Sing opened up, Passengers, Why Him, Assassin's Creed, and this is the field that A Monster Calls found itself in the midst of. But without the rocket fuel of a really tangible awards campaign, it was going to struggle. And so it sort of proved that Focus Features still just opened it up broadly, but it was 3 weeks in before it moved up to 1,500 screens and got up to number 12 at the US box office, took a couple of $1 million, but still wasn't breaking the top 10, and it's clear that momentum wasn't with it. The momentum instead was looking like it was with films like Hidden Figures and La La Land, and there was this film Moonlight that was in and around that wasn't dropping out of the box office anytime soon either. And A Monster Calls was just starting to get a little bit lost in the crush of it all. In fact, its US gross in the end would be ranked, I mean, it's no way around it really, would be ranked as a disappointment, $3.7 million. And without the oxygen of publicity, I'm not a massive fan of awards campaigns and things really, but A Monster Calls is a cast iron example of what happens if you don't get that chance, if you don't get that little bit of limelight on you, because I maintain it is an outstanding film, but barely anyone noticed it in the States on its first run. Outside of the States, it had a lot, well, it had sufficient success that it picked up $43 million outside of America. The key markets for it, in fact, well, Spain was the big one, that it had opened in October in Spain. Bayona, of course, a Spanish director, and this was a reasonable success in Spain. And also it did okay in the UK as well. The areas where it was given a hefty push and a release date that gave it a bit of space, well, those were the ones where it just managed to get its head above water. The film then came to the end of its run, barely covering its production costs. That was before you get to distribution and such like, and with a relatively empty awards cabinet. But what it's left behind is this really, I get quite on my high horse about this really strong film that you can show to a younger audience, and really does open up the kind of conversations that cinema can be a catalyst for, and sometimes a necessary catalyst for. And I've deliberately paired The Shape of Water with A Monster Calls for showing, in this particular episode, I usually try and pick two films that aren't massively related, but in this case, these are both cast iron examples of what happens when a genre movie just talks about interesting and important stuff. It may be the case that The Shape of Water deservedly took the Oscar, deservedly took the box office gold. That doesn't mean A Monster Calls didn't deserve more than it got. Hopefully, by me doing a little bit on it in this episode as well, it may encourage one or two more of you to seek it out. For Bayona, meanwhile, the realisation of this film was a catalyst to him landing his next production. That would be Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom. And that, my friends, is a story for another time. Which all brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. I mean, if I've not bored you completely, I'm just about hanging in on Twitter at the moment at Simon Brew. I'm on Blue Sky as well at the moment, which I'm finding a lot more fun. That's also at Simon Brew. The Film Stories project is at Film Stories. On Facebook or at facebook.com/Film Stories Online. Our YouTube channel is youtube.com/Film Stories. We're just starting to put our podcasts on there as well. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. This is updated every weekday with movie news, features, reviews, mayhem, things like that. We're doing bits of TV and gaming on there as well. We're still doing the same amount of movie stuff, so we're not diluting that. We're just trying to tell more stories, really. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, meanwhile, that's where you'll find out more, all about our magazines, and you'll be able to pick up copies of those. Hugely appreciated any support you give those. We're about to unleash the biggest ever issue of Film Stories magazine. I'm so proud of it. I really hope you like it. The most important thing, though, in all of this is that you're all right, and that you all take care, that you look after yourselves and stay safe. I'm going to head off now, watch another load of films to get ready for the next episode of Film Stories. More than ever, really, thank you for your support. Thank you for your time. This has been Film Stories. I will be back with more soon. But in the meantime, look after yourself. Take care.